Okay, again. So welcome everyone to this first MSCL colloquium. It's really great to see so many different faces and to have such a diverse group. As already said before, maybe we can exchange contacts after the presentation and the Q&A because I think we share a lot of interests. My name is Lou Klaassen. I'm here at the Rachel Carson Center, where I'm also working on a critical perspective on planetary health. So we should definitely all create an email thread or something. And yeah, it's a great pleasure to have our two presenters here today who will give a talk on the Planetary Uncanny, More Than Human Entanglements, and the Planetary Health Humanities. We have with us Dr. Leonie Bossert, who's a postdoctoral assistant at the Chair of Philosophy of Technology and Media at the University of Vienna, a member of the Young Academy of the Heidelberg Academy of Science and Humanities, the Center for Interdisciplinary Research at the University of Bielefeld, and an associate member of the Center for Environmental and Technology Ethics in Prague. I think you are also hosting a very interesting conference soon, so maybe you can send that link and do a bit of advertisement for that later. Leonie's research focuses on the intersection of animal and environmental ethics, including technology ethics, microbial ethics, and the normativity of sustainability and sustainable artificial intelligence. And then secondly, we have Dr. Davina Höll here with us, who is an assistant professor at the Center for Gender and Diversity Research at Tübingen University and an associate member of the EXC Controlling Microbes to Fight Infections Center or program also at Tübingen, and a member of the Obama Institute for Transnational American Studies at Mainz University. She specializes in medical and environmental humanities, focusing on pandemics, human microbe relations, planetary health, and reproduction. And in her second book project, she's currently venturing into the microbiome research, historical, epistemological, ethical, and cultural implications. So the talk will last approximately 25 minutes, after which we will open the floor to questions, which you can ask by raising your digital hand or real hand, and also by writing in the chat. I will hope to be able to accommodate all of the questions. So then without further ado, I'll give the floor to the two of you. And yeah, I think you have a presentation.
Yeah. Yes, thank you so much. Hello to everyone, and thank you for having us. I'm trying to share our presentation. It should be visible now. Can all of you see it? Perfect. Okay, so yeah, thank you again for the kind introduction. And yeah, in the following minutes, we want to talk to you about the planetary uncanny and what the term or the concept can offer us to better understand the many, often ambivalent planetary more than human entanglements, especially in regard to the challenges that planetary health and with it, of course, the planetary health humanities face. Our outline goes as follows. After a very brief introduction, in the first part of our presentation, Leonie will explore how the long history of imagining microbe, non-human animals, and human entanglements as forms and practices of othering has shaped human, non-human interaction in mostly problematic ways that extend far beyond the pandemic times of crises. In the second part, that will I do, I want to demonstrate how Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak's conceptualization of the planetary uncanny may help us to understand these precarious entanglements better and discuss, by the example of Amitav Ghosh's novel Gun Island, the power and productivity of literary reimagining and communicating, and I think this is important also for this group especially, the planetary uncanny for present and future states of planetary emergencies. And then we want to conclude with discussing how non-anthropocentric planetary health humanities offer a pathway toward global multi-species justice by challenging practices of othering specifically and fostering more respectful perspectives on other living beings and human fellow beings as well. So, as you all know and realize every day, we are in the midst of overlapping socio-ecological crises of planetary proportions. These crises are not isolated, they are deeply interconnected, forming what Achille Mbembe describes as a time of planetary entanglement. During such times, we are acutely, though not always consciously, aware of the intricate entanglements between humans and the more than human world. These entanglements pose profound challenges to individuals and societies alike. Today, we will explore one prominent example of these precarious entanglements that are pandemics. Pandemics bring into sharp relief interactions between microbes, animals, and humans, which in the cultural imagination, as well as in the public discourse, are often perceived as distinctly uncanny, as we want to argue, and are very often accompanied by practices of othering, which create and perpetuate problematic human, non-human interactions, as I said, that reach beyond pandemic contexts.
So a warm welcome from my side as well. And yeah, we think that looking at forms of othering is highly necessary when calling for more respectful relations to other beings, as we do call for. And microbes thereby can be an especially interesting example because they could be seen as the ultimate other. Back, please. Because they are in no way comparable to us humans and to other vertebrates. And we use the last pandemic as an example because within the COVID-19 pandemic, different forms of othering occurred and certain groups of humans, other animals, and microbes experienced more harm than other groups. And we will discuss that in the following slides. But before that, I want to say something about terminology. Of course, othering and otherness need to be differentiated. While discussing the otherness of other beings can be done in a positive manner, for example, when discussing how to respect the other being in light of their otherness, othering is a social practice that in most cases comes along with negative implications because the other is in one way or another subordinated. So when speaking about the othering of microbes, next, please. It's interesting to note that since their very discovery by Anthony van Leeuwenhoek, microbes were perceived as highly uncanny and monstrous creatures. And so tellingly also one of the earliest artistic depictions of microbes that you can see here on the slide by William Heath bears the title Monster Soup. And as we still very often perceive microbes as highly uncanny creatures that threaten us, we established some kind of principle of eradication towards them. And with the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, this principle was immediately revived. Throughout the pandemic, again, a strongly militarized use of language was adopted regarding the virus. So the virus was blamed for the tragic death of millions of people, but not the human actions that had accumulated to trigger the pandemic in the first place. And in line with this, policies that fought the symptoms rather than the causes were adopted, like, for example, strong hygiene regimes with antibiotic sanitizing. And this is, of course, not to say that this wasn't very useful when the pandemic was in place. However, we think that one also needs to consider what Brett Finlay and colleagues convincingly argue. Next, please. So I quote that current pandemic control measures and practices will have broad, uneven, and potentially long-term effects for the human microbiome across the planet, given the implementation of physical separation, extensive hygiene, travel barriers, and other measures that influence overall microbial loss and inability for reinoculation. End of the quote. And this also led the World Health Organization to warn of a so-called silent pandemic of antibiotic resistance. And why we bring this example here, or what we think this can tell us, is that this form of othering is not only negative for the living beings that are seen as the others, here viruses or microbes, but also it can also have very negative implications for the ones who are doing these social practices of othering, namely us humans. And this is due to the existing very close entanglements from us with the ones that we see as the ultimate other. And speaking about animals in the context of pandemics, next please. One must say, as also the historian Olaf Priese states, that there have been mass killings of animals to prevent, contain, or terminate pandemic outbreaks during all pandemics. So here, click please, also an example from another pandemic in the context of the outbreak of the bubonic plague in London. I quote again, "Wherefore we were ordered to kill all the dogs and cats. They are capable of carrying the effluvia or infectious steams of bodies infected, and therefore it was in the beginning of the infection an order was published by the Lord Mayor that all the dogs and cats should be immediately killed, and an officer was appointed for the execution. It's incredible what a prodigious number of those creatures were destroyed. I think they talked of 40,000 dogs and 5 times as many cats." End of the quote. And Priese sees this as a kind of blind activism, an activism at any cost that was fueled and consolidated by a human-animal antagonism, so by an extreme form of othering and of subordinating the other. And next, please. This could also be observed during the COVID-19 pandemic with individuals of different animal species. And here we take the mink example. As you may all recall, the case of the Danish minks. These Danish minks were supposed to harbor a specific SARS-CoV-2 mutation that could endanger the hoped-for success of the vaccine campaign. And so the animals were once again perceived as being an existential threat to us humans, a threat that need to be fought off. And therefore, in June 2020, all Danish minks were culled. And the massive media coverage of the so-called zombie minks really reads like a Gothic tale. And due to time limitations, I don't go much into detail about this Gothic tale now, but maybe we have time for it later. However, it's very important to note that today experts have determined that the mass culling was unnecessary and carried out despite a decided lack of scientific evidence. So it can also, again, be seen as a kind of blind activism, the kind of blind activism Priese describes, and that was only possible due to forms of othering that allowed us to see these animals as killable beings. And when talking about humans in the context of pandemics, next, please. First of all, it needs to be mentioned that xenophobia, racism, classism, sexism, misogyny, and homophobia can be seen as integral parts of all outbreak narratives. For example, to name just one little example out of many, many infectious diseases were named after geographical places, such as, for example, the French disease, the Spanish flu, or Ebola, because it always seemed to be highly important to stress that the source for the outbreak was an alien force and that the supposedly responsible part is foreign. And with this, the otherness of the blameworthy was highlighted. And this practice can, for many reasons, be seen as problematic, and that also led the World Health Organization, click please, to establish guidelines for naming emerging diseases. So in these guidelines, it reads, I quote, "Terms that should be avoided in disease names include geographical locations, people's names, species of animal or food, and terms that incite undue fear." But this was exactly what we could also observe during the COVID-19 pandemic. Next, please. When the old and unfortunately again new US American president called the COVID-19 pandemic the Chinese flu, and that awoke a lot of anti-Asian sentiments and violence against particular group of people. And in general, the COVID-19 pandemic revealed a lot of structural inequalities. In the US, Black, Indigenous, and people of color have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic. And that was not only the case in the US, but around the globe. And so highlighting all of these different cases that are just some examples of many examples, we think that these pandemic triad of microbe, animal, and human entanglements perfectly highlights that we have entangled vulnerabilities that on the one hand occur naturally, but they also occur due to problematic forms of othering that were very present during this last pandemic. And within such global crisis, specific non-human and human others are very often demonized as being the reason of disease and death. And with this demonization and seeing them as the reason for disease and death, they are also perceived as being deeply uncanny. And with this, I hand over to Davina again.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I'm sorry for not being that efficient with forwarding the slides. I hope to do better. So as Leonie just has pointed out, specific non-human and human others are demonized as causative of disease and death, and thus perceived as particularly uncanny, which means on the one hand, as we know from the Freudian tradition of the conceptualization of the uncanny is, though intricately linked to us, also the ultimate other. The precarious entanglements of microbe, animal, and humans that we call the uncanny pandemic triad became especially tangible again during COVID-19, as Leonie just has pointed out, and that was also the reason why we developed the term in a recent paper that came out just last year in this fantastic collection, Planetary Health, Humanities, and Pandemics, and it was called Narrating the Uncanny Triad, Imagining Microbe, Animal, and Human Entanglements within the Planetary Health Humanities. We found this term especially useful as a symbol for the intricacies of planetarity and planetary health specifically. And this, of course, not only during pandemic times, as it points towards a very fundamental caveat between utopian visions of the planetarity, all interconnectedness of living beings and non-living matter that we kind of hope for, right? And on the other hand, the all too often precarious lived experience of these entanglements. So in this sense, the uncanny triad, or the pandemic uncanny triad of microbes, animals, and humans, is directly and also intricately again linked to a broader concept, and this is the planetary uncanny. The term, the planetary uncanny, was originally termed by feminist critic, post-colonial theorist, comparative literature scholar, and prominent forethinker of the concept of planetarity as well, Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak. Following Sigmund Freud's definition of the uncanny, as I quote, signifying the turning of what is homely into something unheimlich, end of quote, Spivak imagines, and I quote again, our attempt to track planetarity as making our home unheimlich or uncanny, end of quote. Meaning that the planet as a given reality of human and non-human life, and this now is a remarkable wording that we might discuss further later, is so the planet is in the species of alterity. And I find this really just astounding, this wording. So to say, in a state of extreme otherness, and as such distinctly uncanny. So Spivak writes, the planet, belongs to another system, one that can be scientifically described when it is put in the epistemological and disciplinary value form. But even then, its edges are indescribable. The planet that we inhabit belongs to another system, an otherness that we cannot access. So in a way, recognizing the planet's otherness and simultaneously realizing that this otherness is ultimately inaccessible to us is, as we think, at the core of Spivak's concept of the uncanny. Now, Indian-American writer, anthropologist, and cultural critic Amitav Ghosh is arguably one of the most prominent non-Western voices in climate change discourse. And I know that you just had him with you in Munich for a great series of events, so you may know him much better than we do. Nonetheless, in his influential non-fiction work, The Great Derangement, he also points toward the many, quote, uncanny instances in which the planet seems to have been toying with humanity, end of quote. Although Ghosh neither refers directly to a planetary uncanny nor references Spivak's conception, interestingly enough, but speaks of the environmental uncanny. However, taking a close look at Ghosh's idea of the environmental uncanny shows that his understanding of the environment is decidedly planetary and non-anthropocentric as well. So he writes, no other word comes close to expressing the strangeness of what is unfolding around us. The uncanny and improbable events that are beating at our doors seem to have stirred a sense of recognition, an awareness that humans were never alone, that we have always been surrounded by beings of all sorts who share elements of that which we had thought to be most distinctively be our own, will, thought, and consciousness. However, for Ghosh, there's another side to the uncanny regarding planetary entanglements, the human, and I quote Ghosh again, stain of forgetfulness. Ghosh argues that there has always been an awareness of the precariousness of human existence, and that the mystery in relation to the agency of non-humans lies not in the renewed recognition of it, but rather in how this awareness came to be suppressed in the first place. So in this way, and in the truest sense of the Freudian understanding of the uncanny, the individually and collectively suppressed knowledge about these deep entanglements keeps haunting humanity up until today. As the vital and crucial knowledge, or this vital and crucial knowledge is, as we argue with Ghosh, suppressed into and that's our term, anthropocentric subconscious, humanity's task now is to find ways to tackle the return of the repressed, to imagine the unthinkable beings and events of this era. So, a novelist himself, Ghosh sees the literary imagination at the forefront of this quasi-psychoanalytical endeavor. He says, because the uncanny is important to represent the contemporary world, Ghosh advocates for adequately reintroducing it into fiction to communicate uncanniness and improbability, the magnitude and interconnectedness of the transformations that are now underway. In his novel Gun Island, which can be considered the Great Derangement's companion piece, as our colleague Heike Harting termed it, Ghosh readily provides the prototype for this new poetics of the planetary uncanny himself. In the final scene and climax of his novel that moves through times and spaces, globally connecting human, non-human, and more than human entities, once again, the human and the non-human are joined in an uncanny triad. However, this time they are not entangled in a pandemic outbreak. Instead, they point towards the power of thinking the unthinkable in a hopeful way. Near the end of the novel, whales, dolphins, millions of birds, bioluminescent microorganisms, and a godlike woman suddenly unite in a miraculous spectacle, a storm of living beings, to ensure the safe landing of a refugee boat on the Italian shore. And instead of quoting this really fantastic passage, I asked this time Microsoft designer artificial intelligence to come up with an image of this final scene, and this is what you can see here. And we could also later talk about the limitations of artificial intelligence in rendering literary imagination in other medium. But I mean, what you can see here, I think, or what is conveyed quite good, is that this scene is surely deeply unusual and also kind of uncanny, right? But it seems that precisely the uncanny and the miraculous quality of the event raised the suppressed awareness of the planetary other and made the shared human non-human experience so powerful. So Ghosh's novel Gun Island provides a vivid example of how literature can reimagine the uncanny in productive ways and transform it into a regenerative force, emphasizing hope and the possibility of multi-species justice. Ghosh highlights the power of storytelling to confront the return of the suppressed knowledge of humanity's deep entanglements with the planetary other. His works call for a literary imagination and with it also ways of communication capable of representing the interconnectedness and improbability of our contemporary world, urging us to embrace improbable solutions alongside what we for the longest time thought to be improbable catastrophes, which are actually happening all the time. And with that, I hand over to Leonie for our conclusion.
Thanks. So, yeah, we argued in this talk and also in the paper that the uncanny pandemic triad is manifested through an othering of microbes, non-human animals, and particular groups of fellow humans that are perceived as deeply uncanny. And this led to attitudes and social practices in which microbes are reduced to their potential pathogenicity instead of recognizing our human dependencies on them. Other animals are not perceived as ends in themselves, but either as killable products for human ends or as killable disease-carrying threats to human health. And fellow humans are divided into us and them, and thereby reactivating hostile perspectives on foreigners and so-called outgroups, which then amplifies social inequalities and injustices. And to overcome such practices, we think that it's highly necessary to, next please, to recognize our human dependency on other individuals, for example, on other microbes that could be seen as the ultimate other. And this could help to overcome the paradigm of human supremacy. And that, click please, that would also mean, the red cross is important, that would also mean that we would overcome such narratives as the one represented in the picture you can see here on the slide, namely that humanity represented by white men can in the end again heal the planet, most likely by technological means. And we think this is a rather misleading form of, for example, science communication in the context of planetary health. Also, it's quite important to accept the ambivalence of various forms of relationships that we have to other beings. So we need to learn again to withstand uncomfortable feelings, but still treat the others to which we have these uncomfortable feelings with respect. And we should also learn to accept some forms of uncanniness instead of trying to eradicate the uncanny completely. Next. And we hope that such a new perspective would lead to more respectful relations with other living beings and to better forms of cohabitation. And these are also the core claims of the planetary health debate, the planetary health humanities, and of approaches of multi-species justice that are important and worth of striving for. And with this, we once again want to thank you for the opportunity to be here and to discuss with you. And yeah, we are very much looking forward to the discussion now. Thank you for your attention.